Bien, écoutez, je vais commencer, je ne vais pas garder le micro très longtemps, rassurez-vous. Donc je vous présente le professeur Tuan, Prix Vautrin-Lud 2012. Hein. Vous savez que le Vautrin-Lud, c'est le prix international de géographie. Donc le professeur Tuan a été nommé l'année dernière dans le lauréat de ce MIESI. Donc je vais prendre la parole pour 45 minutes, je crois, hein, 45 minutes.
45.
Hein? Ok. 15 minutes de l'heure. Maybe some question after that?
Sure.
And, alors, je vais vous pourrez poser quelques questions à l'issue de sa communication, pardon, qui s'appelle Home as Elsewhere. Le prof Tuan, c'est pour votre
That's it.
Non, no problem, no problem.
Thank you for a very warm welcome. Je regrette de parler en anglais, plutôt qu'en français, qui, comme tout le monde, c'est la langue de la civilisation. Alors, mes amis, on doit accepter ses limites. Home as elsewhere. All animals move out of their home base when, for one reason or another, conditions deteriorate, or when they are threatened by enemies. They move because they are pushed. Only humans move because they are not only pushed, but pulled by images of something better elsewhere. Much of human history is one of migration. On the other hand, much more of it is of people staying put in one place, generation after generation. Even when they see better living conditions elsewhere, they are content to remain where they are and enjoy what they have than to venture into the unknown. Humans are conservative. They have a fondness for the familiar, for home, for security over adventure. And yet, how do we know that even the most sedentary people do not dream of an elsewhere? In what follows, I will recapture what I take to be a fact, the centrality of home to humans, and then suggest nonetheless the tug of an envisaged elsewhere, even if no action follows. Home and its Germanic, Gothic, Old Nordic, and Lithuanian cognates all connote abode, dwelling, village, a safe place. The Chinese 家 or 家乡, a non-Indo-European language, carries a similar material and emotional load of meaning. By comparison, the French chez moi, chez soi is out of line in that it emphasizes a personal relationship. To be chez soi is to be, as it were, en famille. Lacking in that word is the feel of material weight. On the other hand, maison takes one perhaps a tack too far in the other direction, in that it invokes too much architecture. And then there is demeure, but that French word lacks the spoony sentimentality of Heim and home. Home, to give it a slightly fuller definition, is the locale of human warmth and material sustenance, moral probity, and spiritual comfort. So understood, which people best meet the criteria? Ethnographic evidence points to the hunter-gatherers. Their way of life is so intimately and gratifyingly interwoven with the land and its resources that the possibility of moving elsewhere or adopting another people's way of life never seemed to have crossed their minds. Should they be forced to move or adopt, they suffer severe demoralization from which they seldom fully recover. Numerous cases can be cited. Outstandingly, the Mabuti forest dwellers of the Congo, the Kagan of Brazil, the sand bushmen of the Kalahari Desert, and the Australian Aborigines. What about peasant farmers? Aren't they also deeply attached to home and soil? City people certainly think so. To them, peasants tilling the earth seem to fuse with it. They are, as one expression goes, children of the earth. And what they do year after year has the feel of a natural cycle. Yet, I wonder, is their attachment quite so deep? How does it compare with that of hunter-gatherers? The Tao Te Ching, a Chinese classic that dates back to the 3rd century BC, raises a doubt, for it has a passage that urges villagers to stay put and not be tempted to go elsewhere. Such urging would not, of course, be necessary if loyalty to place can be taken for granted. This is chapter 8. It says, let the people refrain from migrating to distant places. Let them be content with their food and clothing, satisfied with their homes and simple ways of living. Though their neighbors are so close that they are within sight of each other and can hear their cocks crow and their dogs bark, let the two peoples have nothing to do with one another. Whatever the significance of this admonition, it remains perfectly true that old-time farmers are rooted as modern men and women are not. Mobility, like individualism, are features of modern life, the two being closely linked. An individual dissatisfied with community settled ways moves out to take advantage of opportunities elsewhere. Mean to them. Has it become merely a temporary abode, a way station, or even just an investment in contrast to home's traditional sentiment-laden meanings? Home, the real lived-in home, evokes memories in images unlike those of any other place. What might these be? For middle-class Europeans and Americans, they plausibly include such common places as the porch that overlooks a tree-lined street, the afternoon light that streams in through a corner window, the comforting food odors of the kitchen, the sound of the lawn mower in summer and of the snowplow in winter, and certain ordinary doings of life. Greeting the mailman, scolding the dog, barbecuing in the backyard with family and neighbors, that, though prosaic, can nevertheless be etched in memory. The most vivid hauntings are, however, likely to be those of childhood and of childhood's home. Why? Well, consider the following facts. Home is never more a nurturing shelter than to the very young, who are well aware of their vulnerability. Children's engagement with home has a directness and immediacy that grown-ups, more prone to critical appraisal, have lost. Children's senses, undulled by habit, are keen. Moreover, they like to touch. They know the world through tactile intimacies. They live close to the ground, the source of many odors, and odors, like touch, stir the emotions at a more primitive level than do hearing and sight. And last but not least, children have no pressing responsibilities that divert them from the full sensory experience. John Updike, a keen observer of middle-class America, captures these points in a short story. He tells of a child who woke up with a sore throat and stayed home from school. He called imperiously to his mother, who carried up to him his breakfast of fresh orange juice, seedy from his squeezing, the toast warm from his toasting and cut into strips, the Rice Krispies, the blue cream pitcher, the sugar. The child, sunk into the fever-swollen mountains and valleys of the blankets, where books and crayons kept losing themselves. Outside, grown-ups attended to their duties. No duty was laid on the child, however, other than to live, to stay safe and get well, to do that large something called nothing. The house in all its riches attended to him, settling, ticking, clucking in its stillness. Grown-ups too know something of this early caring aspect of home, as well as home's ample sensory stimuli that for all their fleeting existence add up as days, months, and years go by. The result is a rich yet subtle ambience that is home's unique signature. Since this ambience is hard to put into words, it is rarely acknowledged at a conscious level. Also adding up as time passes and contributing to home's difference from other places are routines that create solid comforts. The word routine suggests the humdrum and the inconsequential. However, unlike the routines of workplace and office, those of home are not inconsequential, for they are dictated by the cyclical requirements of biological life. Routine converts place into home, but how long does it take to do so? Not generations, as we might think, but more like decades or even years. If this sounds implausible, it is because we fail to distinguish between being rooted in place and having a sense of place. Rootedness is or can be an objective measure. Archaeological and historical research shows that some people have lived in the same place for centuries. Sense of place is, by contrast, a subjective measure, having less to do with length of habitation than with the people's affinity for the substance and aura of a place. People who are objectively rooted may nevertheless have a limited grasp of time span, how far it extends into the past and the future. Hunter-gatherers, for example, tell stories of their ancestors, but these reach only a generation or two before they merge with mythical founders and heroes. Their view of the natural environment also lacks temporal depth. The Maputi, a group of hunter-gatherers in the Congo forest, know intimately the plants and animals upon which they depend for their livelihood, yet show little knowledge of their stages of maturation. They are unaware that the aquatic larvae they eat turn into mosquitoes, or that caterpillars turn into butterflies. Some rooted peoples have created high culture with writing as one of its proudest adornments. Such people might be expected to value their past and to have recorded in writing. Not necessarily so, however, as the case of India shows. Rather than record the good times and bad times, the successes and failures of the past, as the Chinese have done, Indians chose to bolster their sense of collective self with a rich body of myths and legends. Museums are another means to memorialize ancestral accomplishments. Significantly, neither China nor India thought of building them until the influence of the West was felt. America, on the other hand, showcased its past before it had much past to showcase. Boston established a historical society in 1791. New York did so in 1804. Others soon followed. In each instance, the society's purpose was to collect and preserve documents that told a more or less flattering story. But not only written documents were preserved. Also preserved and put on display were material artifacts such as old furniture, tools, and all sorts of bric-a-brac. Such humble collections might constitute the core of a future museum. By the 1960s, there were some 2,500 museums in the United States, as compared with the 274 museums known to exist on the Indian subcontinent. The United States is a young country that constantly reaches out to the future. Old neighborhoods are demolished to make room for high-rises and shopping malls. Such future orientation means that Americans lack a proper sense of place, which requires, among other things, an appreciation of the past. While this is true, it is also true that an excess of appreciation can work against a sense of place. America is saddled with this excess, it being a country that officially designates certain buildings and neighborhoods as historic landmarks to be protected against not only demolition but change. And it is famed for unabashed boosterism of its towns and cities. Of course, many small rural towns in heartland America do not advertise themselves, are not self-conscious about their past, or boastful of their future. Time in such places is not directional, but cyclical, as nature's course is cyclical. Or it is the thick present, that is to say, it can seem to stand still, like those drowsy Sundays that never end. The people who live in small rural towns feel rooted, and they may be said to have a deep sense of place, even though that sense is not given articulation, and perhaps even because it is not verbalized, articulated. Helen Sandmeyer comes close to depicting the mood of such a place. This is what she says of her own hometown in Ohio, a small place called Xenia. It was home the same day by day, year after year. The town has no high moment of beauty and perfection to lay an obligation on us to preserve it as a museum. It encourages no glamorous illusion that life once was wholly fair. It is a background that makes no demand on its children. It does not sustain in them an extravagant hope. In these streets, under these roofs, they are free to dream their dreams in peace. They are also to forget them when they must, and to accept instead the humdrum daily life of the generations of mankind, the same life that has given the scene that weight and density which even children busy with their sleds have apprehended. So this is a description of an American heartland rural town, which I claim has a deep sense of place, even though it is not articulated. Now, compare St. Meyer's Xenia with the Heimat as idealized in a South Tyrolean almanac of the year 1953. An Austrian town's past is undoubtedly deeper and more colorful than that of an Ohio town. Yet, I maintain that its sense of rootedness and of place is weakened rather than strengthened by an overblown rhetoric of appreciation. The Tyrolean almanac declares of Heimat that it is, first of all, the Mother Earth that gulps down God's clouds, sun, and storms, so that together they prepare the bread and the wine that rest on our table and give us strength to lead a good life. Heimat is landscape. Heimat is the landscape we have experienced. That means one has been fought over, menaced, filled with the history of families and towns and villages. Our Heimat is the Heimat of knights and heroes, of battles and victories, of legends and fairy tales. But more than all this, our Heimat is the land that has become fruitful through the sweat of our ancestors. I'm making perhaps the unorthodox point that in this rhetoric that has overreached, actually diminished the sense of place compared with this very humble town in Ohio. A fundamental appeal of house and home, and for that matter of any solid material object, is its projection of stability and permanence. We humans need both, since we, creatures of mood and flesh, are neither. We die and quickly exit the world. Material objects, by contrast, endure, and they can be passed on to posterity. The chair I'm sitting on should be good for another 50 years, writes a reporter for the New Yorker magazine. The typewriter should clatter into the 21st century. This solid glass paperweight could be darn near eternal. People who may not be born yet should come by my house and snatch them up as the wonderful bargains they will be. That's why I took good care of them, to extend their usefulness beyond the unimaginable day when I am no longer here. The big obituaries of prominent people refer to legacies they left behind. And maybe they did, and maybe they didn't. I'm definitely going to leave a black Underwood typewriter in very good condition, cheap And who knows what that could lead to. In 1983, when the article was written, it was still possible to believe that an Underwood upright typewriter could be a living legacy. Only a couple of years later, the word processor displaced it, and the typewriter's future life, if it had any, would be in an antique shop. Home itself is not as enduring as it seems. Not that it falls apart, rather its human dwellers do. As humans grow older, objects start to withdraw or turn hostile. The table that was a source of pride becomes a sharp-edged threat in the dark, and the stairway that promised access becomes a barrier. As for human relationships, home is customarily remembered as a cove of mutual support and comfort, forgetting that it can also be a prison in which feelings that stew in confined space turn into hatred and despair. Life's tragic comic dramas occur mostly in the home. Between them stretch dull periods of inconsequentiality. On the bright side, home is where people rest and recoup. It is where they sleep. Now, sleep would seem to be an unqualified good, and yet it is not without ambivalence. In dreamless sleep, people are at one with the world, a state that is much desired but rarely achieved while awake. The desire to merge is, however, a sort of death wish. To be alive is to be separate. It is to break out of home's cocoon for the chillier, more invigorating air outside. When people leave home, they do so, for the most part, out of necessity. A longing to return follows. Such longing, if severe and prolonged, can make people melancholic and even ill, sick. In 1688, Johannes Hofer of Mulhouse sought to address the cause before an academic audience. He was defending his dissertation, but the dissertation couldn't be about something so commonplace as Heimweh, homesickness. So he coined a word with Greek roots, nostalgia. The new word made depression respectable, a disease that could be treated. But once so recognized, it aroused fear. People were reluctant to stay away from home for long periods. They learned that English sailors pressed into service and Swiss soldiers stationed in foreign lands were especially susceptible. In the early part of the 18th century, a common explanation of why Swiss soldiers so readily fell ill was that they missed the milk from their own valley, and that they also missed their mother's loving care. But these explanations seem to denigrate the manly character of the Swiss soldiers. So a more impersonal, scientific hypothesis was offered, namely that when Swiss left their mountain homelands, their blood vessels were compressed by the denser air, thus making them lethargic and sad. Sentimentality for home might be expected of old Europe. In America, the land of immigrants and of mobility, it should be less in evidence. Yet, one of the most tricky expressions of the love of home, an expression that still adorns greeting cards, are lines composed by the American songwriter J.H. Payne in 1822. Home, sweet home, and be it ever so humble, there's no place like home. William Arms Fisher's Going Home is equally popular. It was written in 1922 and set to the music of the Dvorak's New World Symphony. Going home, I'm going home. Quiet like some still day, I'm going home. Language articulates and enhances our beliefs. Certain grammatical constructions show the profound appeal of home place and community, by comparison with which elsewhere is distant and insignificant, and yet under certain conditions, elsewhere too can be a lure. The constructions are the personal pronouns we, you, she, he, and they. The spatial demonstratives, this, that, and those. The adverbs of location, here, there, and yonder, and the adverbs of time, now, then. All of these constructions privilege the close at hand. In human relationships, we or us matter most. You matter less. And still farther out, mattering still less, is the third person, he or she and they. Roland Barthes says that if in conversation we hear a man refer to his friend as he in the third person singular rather than as Paul, we will know that their relationship has cooled. The spatial demonstratives stress the same bias. This matters, that and those progressively less so. When Bertrand Russell was asked what he and his friend did with their time, he sadly replied, "We did this and that, but alas, mostly that." That can only be inconsequential. And for those, they are beyond the pale. How does one arouse fervor for one's homeland? One uses repeatedly the spatial demonstrative this. Shakespeare shows how it can be done in the following lines from Richard II. This happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in a silver sea, which serves it as the office of a wall, or as a most, or at the most defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands. This blessed pot, this earth, this realm. Each this swells further the patriot's sense of belongingness, virtue, and pride. Adverbs of location and of time have become a little more ambivalent under the influence of romanticism, at least in English usage. Here and now are still privileged. Here is where I am and where we are. There is where you are, and yonder is where they are. Here is now, there is then, and then is either the future or the past. Yonder is far away, and far away is the unknown and scary. Zulu, the Zulu word for far away, is decidedly negative. It is where someone cries out, "Oh mother, I'm lost." But in the modern Western world, far away connotes something magically appealing. Far away and long ago is how a fairy tale typically begins. Then connotes the distant, and the distant can be the past as things were better then, or the future as in sit down, then the show will begin. But with sufficient distance, then becomes far away and timeless, in utopian place where no one ages and no one dies. Ponce de Leon in 1512 searched for the fabled fountain of youth in Florida. James Hilton, in his novel The Lost Horizon, placed the land of eternal youth in remote Tibet. But every holiday resort makes a claim to being outside of time and its burdens, the idyllic place where no one needs to wear a watch. For the watch, notwithstanding the circular motion of its hands, reminds us of time's inexorable march toward death. A feature of modern life is the range of technical means that link us instantly to distant parts of the world. We can always be elsewhere, and although the elsewhere may not be appealing and may even be repellent, it is nonetheless able to seduce our imagination and hold it captive. Suppose I see a cab driver tooling down a winding road in the Colorado mountains. The road and the mountains are his environment. He is bodily there, and his mind, I assume, is on the road. But no, his radio is on, and he's cheering the Cincinnati Reds. Or again, suppose I see a man in an armchair reading a newspaper. I take that room to be his place. He's often there. But you see, bodily, yes, but his eyes are glued to headlines on the front page, and his mind is where his son is, a soldier in Afghanistan. Reading can conjure up a reality so vivid as to overshadow the one we are actually in. An extreme example is the story told about soldiers in the First World War who, in mud-filled trenches and with bullets whistling overhead, read Tolstoy's War and Peace to get war's full flavor. Books and electronic media can take us elsewhere, but only in imagination. When we fall in love, we may actually even gladly abandon home for elsewhere. What need of home when all the comfort and nurture we require, as well as beauty and ecstasy, are provided by the beloved? In romances, lovers leap over the wall to start a new life. My question now is, can one also fall in love with a geographical place, be swept off one's feet by a view, a landscape? The answer is yes. Something like this happened to Hugo Williams, a young man of 21, who drifted from country to country, continent to continent, and ended up in a small boat at the mouth of the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. The men in the boat were friendly. They passed around a cigarette containing hashish. Williams made himself popular by puffing at it. He enjoyed the warm night, the bobbing luminous floats of the fisher boats, the shooting stars between the masts, the laughs in a strange language. He then noticed for the first time how far he was getting from home. Rather than feel homesick, he experienced almost physical pleasure at the thought. I had a similar experience at the same age. A few friends and I arrived at the edge of Death Valley, California at night in a howling dust storm. We couldn't fight the wind and set up tents, so we slept in our sleeping bags. I woke up early in the morning, rubbed my eyes, and was confronted by Death Valley in all its stark, sterile beauty. I felt instant identification with it. Would I have known who I really am if I had never left the humid East? How limiting home can seem in retrospect. It fed and clothed me. It gave me habits and customs, but it held no mirror to the psycho-spiritual kernel of my being. What about yearning for a place that one has only imagined? That too can happen. An example is C.S. Lewis's enthrallment by pure northernness. He has a vision of huge clear spaces hanging above the Atlantic in the endless twilight of northern summers. Remoteness and severity, so different from the cozy Oxford he inhabits, hold for him an irresistible allure. Lewis has never traveled north and was never tempted to do so. Not having been there emboldens rather than limits his imagination. Northernness, one might almost say, is in his genes. Wherever we are, our senses immediately bind us to it. Think, and we are out of our senses, detached and elsewhere. Significantly, a common image of the wise man or seer is one who is blind or can barely see. And a common image of the thinker, intellectual, or nerd is one whose eyesight is poor and has to wear glasses. A sapiente or thinker has no need of home and may indeed believe that homelessness, not being bound to the values and beliefs of a particular place, is a requirement of thinking. Aristotle was apparently the first to recognize this. In an early work, the Protrepticus, he argued that the philosopher should love homelessness, the nowhere, as though it were a country. Who were the intellectuals in Greece's golden age? Plato might be the last to have real roots in society and place. His successors seem to have lived beside society rather than in it. Aristotle and Theophrastus, Zeno, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus were all of them foreigners. Only Epicurus was of Athenian stock, though by birth a colonial. Thinking makes one an exile, which is why thinking, a long process that separates one from place and community, is widely discouraged. As for exile, in the sense of physical expulsion, it was and is considered a calamity. God, after all, deemed it an appropriate punishment for Adam and Eve when they yielded to temptation and ate the apple from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Had they successfully resisted, they would have remained in Eden the perfect home. They would have retained a childlike innocence and lived in ignorance of the heights, depths, and ambiguities of human life. They would have forfeited opportunity for not only intellectual, but also spiritual, moral growth. History provides instances of people forced into exile and suffering deeply from it. And yet, the same people might gain certain spiritual benefits from the displacement, at least in the long run. Consider the Jews, exiled by the Babylonians. They were forced to rob along with other peoples and confront their creeds, with the result that the Jews were able to transcend the narrower tenets of their own religion. In the second Isaiah is enunciated the pure principle of monotheism, and as a world cause, freed from the specifically Palestinian limitations of the cult of Yahweh. Uprooting was able to bring to fruition universalist ideas that existed only in germinal form in the older prophets. In Europe, Jews lived for centuries in ghettos, surrounded by other peoples and cultures. They were able to protect their identity by complicated rituals and taboos, and by never ceasing to dream of their lost homeland. In the 19th century, as the ghetto walls began to crumble, Jews participated increasingly in European society and culture, such that by the early 20th century, they could be said to have flooded Europe's intellectual and spiritual space. Some of them, like Marx, Freud, and Einstein, to quote Leszek Kolakowski, were to become real world conquerors. Thousands found their places in the elites of all realms of civilization, the sciences, the arts, the humanities, and politics. To put this another way, if Jews of the diaspora came to feel at home in foreign lands, it wasn't so much because they wholly immersed themselves in Gentile society and culture, as because they added to them a high cosmopolitan polish of their own making. In 1948, the State of Israel was created. At last, the Jews had their own officially recognized homeland. 60 years after its founding, Israel can boast of prosperity and a high level of culture and scientific achievement. On the other hand, it has become an occupying military power surrounded by hostile neighbors, and a nation unsure of its identity, whether it is religious or liberal secular. This being the case, will Israel be fertile ground for the emergence of thinkers of the scope and depth of Marx, Freud, and Einstein? Will the Jewish people, in other words, have found a homeland, but in the process crippled their universalist spirit? Religion is not about making a home on earth. That's geography. Yet so much that comes under the heading religion is precisely about homemaking, about how to survive and live well in this life. Consider the American Indian corn dance and the Tibetan prayer wheel. The corn dance is widely considered a religious ceremony. Yet, what is its real purpose other than that the earth yield more corn. The Tibetan prayer wheel falls under the category religious, whereas the windmill falls under the category secular. And yet both use wind power to make the earth more a human home. The one turns the wheel to grind corn. The other turns the wheel on which prayers are attached to ward off evil and promote human well-being. Not all placemaking is directed at survival. A place should also satisfy human emotional needs and aesthetic longings. Sacred places, both natural and built, do that well. On the other hand, even secular ceremonials can generate beauty and awe. So what is left that is truly the sacred, that truly distinguishes the sacred from the secular? The moral, but sacred places are hardly more moral or more serene than our secular places. In fact, the opposite may be true. All too often, sacred places are places of violence. Historically, animal sacrifice and in early times, human sacrifice were conducted at the doorsteps of temples and shrines. And not only historically, but in our own time, the more sacred the place, the more likely the blood spilled and flesh torn over it by peoples of rival faiths. Buddhism and Christianity, in their most exalted formulations, are not about homemaking. They are otherworldly and hence cannot be subsumed under geography. Home is elsewhere may well be their motto. In Buddhist legend, Siddhartha Gautama, later known as the Buddha, was a prince whose life began where most human beings would want to end, at the perfect home, one that had the best of material goods and the best of human company. Yet, Siddhartha saw that not even the perfect home could protect him from sickness, old age, and death. So he left it in search of enlightenment and was to find it under not a famous temple or shrine, but under a peepal tree. He then wandered over the Gangetic plain, preaching to followers irrespective of their caste or religion. Enlightenment, as the Buddha saw it, required the death of desire. That was the cause of greed, lust, hatred, and ignorance, which in turn led to suffering and death. To be truly enlightened is to enter nirvana. And nirvana has, in Buddha's words, the taste of freedom. But what does freedom mean here? For to be alive is to be, in a sense, unfree. It is to be bound to the surrounding world by the senses and desire. If home has a deeper meaning than other places, it is precisely because home excels in the tightness of the bond. Nirvana, being placeless, negates all that we understand of geography. Christianity has its roots in Judaism and shares with a profound attachment to homeland and community. Early in Jesus' ministry, more than once he showed his partiality for the house of Israel and to them alone. But soon his message shifted to a universalism that transcended place, community, and culture. To the Samaritan woman who said that her folks worship in the mountains, whereas Jews worship in Jerusalem's temple, Jesus' response was that real worshippers worship in neither, but rather in spirit and in truth. At the Transfiguration, Jesus' disciples were so impressed that they wanted to build a monument in his honor. If it had been done, a sacred place for Christians would have been created, but Jesus would have none of it. Often on the road, Jesus noted that whereas foxes had holes and birds had nests, he had no place to rest his head. Good Roman families were centered on the home. To them, what was especially objectionable about Christians was that they lacked a proper respect for home and hearth. They had no household shrines at which to worship ancestors and gods. They were deficient in family values. The Roman patriarch's word for Christians was peregrinus, by which he meant a bird of passage, a wayfarer, a foreigner, none of which was complimentary. The early Christians, however, turned the meaning around. They took pride in being strangers and pilgrims on the earth, for their true home was elsewhere. Home in the Western world did not acquire its present load of sentiment until well into the 19th century. In the past, it was primarily a shelter or primarily a setting for social display. Only with the rise of the prosperous middle class in the last 2 centuries did home become an enclosed space of comfort and nurture, of dreams and memories, of padded couches and thick carpets, of the boudoir in which to pout and the library in which to think. Home is become so thickly layered with sentiment that to leave it is to abandon an important part of oneself. The result is Heimweh, or homesickness. One yearns to return, but this is not possible because home and self have both changed, and one returns not to the past, but to reconstituted, sepia-tinted images. There may, however, be another sense of returning home, though the word going home would be more accurate. It is the preternatural feeling that one is a mere resident alien on earth, that one's true home is elsewhere. L'origine de ce sentiment en Occident est historiquement la religion chrétienne. Nulle part n'est le déclin rapide de la chrétienté de nos jours plus évident que dans l'érosion de la croyance en notre statut de passager sur cette terre, et en même temps l'affirmation croissante de notre attachement à ce monde, chez nous. Cette affirmation se situe à 2 niveaux. D'un côté, il y a les chrétiens fondamentalistes des États-Unis qui, pour autant qu'ils prêchent les bénédictions du ciel, propagent les séductions de la belle ville matérialiste parmi les biens de cette terre, dont les marques sont la maison familiale confortable et la méga-église. D'autre côté, on trouve les progressivistes libéraux, progressivistes séculaires et cultivés, dont les bonnes œuvres consistent à préserver la planète verte et pour toujours habitable, une demeure permanente pour les êtres humains et les autres espèces vivantes. À quoi d'autre pourrait-il dire se consacrer? Merci.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Tuan, for your very rich intervention. I think that now in Saint-Dié-des-Vosges you feel at home and elsewhere. You are home here, and you are not going home too quickly, because maybe some people will ask some questions. But first of all, I'm still thinking, where did I put my old underwood tipping machine? Maybe my Greek children take it and throw it away, but I couldn't remember exactly what I did with it. And maybe now it's a question to the floor. Is anybody want to ask any questions? Yeah.
Thank you for this amazingly rich exploration of the notion of home. I've learned many things. I've never thought about semantics and the use of personal pronouns to explore this notion. I just wanted to ask two things. I think that human beings need bounds, and for the people who do not have this bound that can be called home, like you mentioned the Jews or the Gypsies, is this bound replaced necessarily by very strong religious or cultural practices that that replace this bound to somewhere that we can call home? And the other question, which has got nothing to do with the first one, is I would like to have your take on what's been going on in China for the last few decades, where it appears that there is no attachment to what we can, the material, to old houses and what can materially represent the past and the traditions of China.
Yes, there are two parts to the question. The first, I think, is on the role of mobility in coming up with a more universalist view of religion. I think it's not really difficult to generalize on this point, but there are examples, and it just seems to make common sense that when one moves about, one tends to lose the kind of deep attachment to a particular locality, and in its old days, its local gods and shrines. Then that would not be the case if one was more nomadic and works about, or even when one becomes an exile, or whole people become exiled, which is certainly considered a tragedy. But I'm pointing out that, at least in some cases, this could turn out to be a blessing in the long run, in that it develops the more universalist aspect of one's spirit. So the second part is about China. I quoted in my talk a small passage in the classic of Taoism, and I was struck with it because it tried to persuade people not to move. I thought farmers, peasants especially, didn't move all over. So, but apparently they were inclined to move, to migrate, and not be stuck in this place. I find that very interesting. And another reason for the interest is the practical mentality of the Chinese, but maybe most people are practical. And that is when the Three Gorge Dam was built, many people were displaced from their old homes. And Westerners thought that, well, isn't this going to start a revolution? I mean, wouldn't the people just rise up in great anger? Well, there was discouragement and so on, but there was nothing like that anger that the West would tend to think of the Chinese as really located. It didn't turn out that way, provided they had some promise of moving to a better place. Another example that in the 1950s that was thought would create rebellion against Mao Zedong was that it was not only the farmland cleared for dams and so on, but also grave mounds were removed. I mean, the Chinese were supposed to be deeply bound to their ancestors, and here to see their grave mounds removed, again, especially Westerners thought that this would start a revolution, counter-revolution against the communists. And again, it didn't happen. But if one sort of dig a little deeper into Chinese history, you found that something like this had happened in the past. Outstandingly, in the 12th and 13th century, the cities, especially Hangzhou, became overcrowded, greatly overcrowded, so there was no land for burial. And at that time, cremation was introduced. And again, one thought, well, how can Chinese accept cremation? I mean, so alien. And yet they did, just because out of necessity, there was no place to bury their dead. So in that sense, I'm not surprised by the Chinese going almost mad rush to modernity and destroying much of their own culture. And this leads to another, I think, interesting point that's rather controversial. And the Tibetans constantly accuse the Chinese of destroying their culture. But the Chinese might reply, oh, maybe we're doing that, but think how we are destroying our own culture on the road to modernity. That's the point.
Any other question? No? Who is having the micro?
Just a small question, also to laugh. I think you know the story of one of our colleagues, a well-known colleague, going around the world, drifting from country to country, giving talk conferences, and bad luck, you know, this guy died last fall in South Korea. So they tried to figure out where he was from. He was well known as a scientist, but he was American. But where did he live? In fact, they checked. He sold his home 5 years ago. He was drifting from country to country without a place. So my question, is it a tragedy or is it a fairy tale? A new way to go through the world and to see a kind of scientific nirvana?
Yes. Well, Bruno Walter was asked whether he felt homesick when he left Germany or Europe for America. And he said, "What home? Beethoven's my home." So wherever he could conduct the symphony, he felt very much in it. And then there's the famous mathematician Paul Erdős, E-R-D-O-S, and he just never had anything like a home, and he just traveled with a suitcase and enjoyed the hospitality of his colleagues. And he worked extremely hard. He had a weak heart, and so his colleagues got worried and asked him to rest. But he said, "Oh, I have an eternity to rest." So
Eternity is like.
Usually your lectures are always brilliant and thought-provoking, and one of the thoughts that your comments provoked me to think about when I was a child growing up in Milwaukee. How did I use home? And it was always a place I came from or I was going to. We never referred to home as a place, actually. It was always house. And I think one of the things that has occurred in American English is that the intensive use of the word home is almost a product of the real estate industry. In the 1970s, they decided that home sounded much more warm and comfortable as something to sell than to sell a house. And I think there was a change in the use of it then. Another point with respect to the movement of people, or the forced migration of people for the Three Gorges project. We had a similar thing in the United States with the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Appalachian Skyway. And I have spoken to people in Appalachia who are still extremely bitter about the federal government for forcing them to leave, and especially because they had to leave behind, underwater in most instances in the TVA project, the graves of their ancestors. They're still really in.
Americans can be very sentimental about home, and you say that the real estate agents promoted that, but they're able to promote that because of these songs, Home Sweet Home, There's No Place Like Home. I mean, that's very American, and they're able to exploit that. And what the use of language is very interesting. There was a time when I, as a child, I had to learn English, and I found the usage very, very baffling. For instance, you always say that I'm going to someplace. I'm going to Saint-Dié for a conference, and I'm going here and there. But what has happened to the two with home? You never say, I'm going to home. I'm going home. So, you know, these subtle differences I find very revealing.
Yeah. Any other question? That's okay. So once again, thank you very much for your brilliant lecture. And we were about to meet here at 5 for the official award. It's probably this place.
Yeah.
You're going at home here.
Yes.
Huh?
Oui, je sais que...